Today we are going to be looking at conflict resolution in marriages. In our last class we considered the role of husbands and wives and how they should function within a marriage. We also have seen how sin in Genesis 3 introduces conflict and struggles into all of the relationships that are in creation, and especially the marriage relationship. Often the result of such kinds of conflict ends up being divorce, and we're going to be examining that right now and looking at ways to resolve conflict. In Malachi chapter 2 verse 16, God tells us what he thinks of divorce. He says, "I hate divorce." Why? I think part of it goes to verse 15 right before that God desires to have godly offspring. And when there is a divorce, if there are no children in the marriage at the time of the divorce, there will be no children forthcoming. If there are children during the time of the divorce, what happens in that divorce is often so discouraging and frustrating to the children that they end up, as they grow up, turning away from the Lord. And so you don't have godly offspring as a result of it. One more reason for God hating divorce is that since marriage is supposed to be a picture of the beautiful, close relationship and communication and companionship that the triune God has, when a husband and wife and their marriage is broken, it's essentially like tearing up a picture, not only of them, but tearing up a picture of God for everybody who knows this particular couple. Malachi 2 in verses 13 and 14 reveals that marital problems often stem from spiritual problems, spiritual unfaithfulness and adultery, spiritual problems taking place. And it leads usually to more spiritual problems as well. Why did God ignore the Israelites' offerings? Because they were insincere in those offerings. They had broken a covenant with God because they'd broken a covenant with each other as husbands and wives. Malachi confirms that marriage is a covenant between God and the husband and the wife. Spousal fidelity leads to spiritual wellness, and unfaithfulness leads to an unhealthy marriage and unhealthy relationships. We might go back, for example, to the idea of there being three again from Ecclesiastes 4. That in a marriage as it's supposed to be, you have a husband, a wife, and God all working together. That cord of three strands that's not easily broken. We've already seen that God's original design for marriage, what it's supposed to be. And Jesus returns to that same design in Matthew 19 when he's confronted by Jewish leaders, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, about how he interprets what Moses has said about marriage. It comes from Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1. Some had interpreted the phrase something indecent to mean marital unfaithfulness. And therefore, because there was that marital unfaithfulness, that indecency, divorce was allowable. Others interpreted the phrase as what becomes displeasing to him, to God, to allow for divorce in almost any instance. Jesus pointed back to God's original design and challenges them and says, how did God design this in the first place? He's inferring to them that they ought to know the answer to that. but their hearts were hard, and he says so. As Jesus teaches, God views husbands and wives not as two people, but as one unit that cannot and should not be broken. They're joined together in an indissoluble unit, permanently joined in God's eyes. God considers marriage sacred and regards it as to be lasting for as long as the two should live. When divorce is granted for reasons other than adultery, God does not consider that divorce to be valid. He considers the marriage bond to still be in force. Paul teaches in agreement with Jesus in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 and 11. He emphasizes that reconciliation is to take place, if at all possible. It's the preferred solution. Remarriage is not allowed when divorce is for unbiblical reasons. Oneness is supposed to be maintained in those times. And Jesus was pointing out that the Pharisees were wrong in inventing all kinds of little stipulations and rules and regulations that would allow for divorce in many instances that weren't what God had allowed for. Certainly, infidelity, unfaithfulness is one of the reasons that divorce can occur. Not that it has to. God's preference would be that even when there is marital unfaithfulness, if there can be forgiveness and reconciliation and something that was broken being brought back together again, that is far more preferable and more honorable and glorifying to Him than simply going ahead and divorcing because, yes, there's been unfaithfulness. Adultery violates the marriage covenant. It is a legitimate reason for divorce, but as I said, not necessarily a required reason. Any other reasons that might be legitimate? Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 7, verses 12 through 14, desertion on the part of the unbeliever. That in a marriage where perhaps two people, husband and wife, get married, and one of them becomes a believer, that the other one wants nothing to do with that and says, I did not bargain for this. I don't want to be involved with a believer, and I am out of here. Paul says in those instances, the believer is not bound to that marriage anymore. The marriage has been dissolved as far as God is concerned because the unbeliever walked out of it. And the believer is free, once again, to marry if he or she so chooses. Now, if it is the believing spouse that walks away, that is not allowable or biblical. There is to be reconciliation that is to be sought, even with the unbelieving spouse. What about, for example, a spouse addicted to drugs or alcohol? Addiction may make it impossible or very, very difficult for a spouse to be faithful to the other spouse because he's actually addicted to one of these substances. They become his love, his preference. And that may be an allowable case. But certainly godly counsel should be sought by the couple and by the church if the couple is within a church and are believers within the church. We've already talked about what if a believing spouse leaves? No, that's not allowable. There should be reconciliation, and the church leadership should be brought into the situation. It's interesting that in Malachi, God says He hates the husband who covers himself with his garment. What is that about? I think it goes back to the time of Boaz and Ruth, where Boaz covers Ruth with his garment as a sign of, I am going to protect you. I am going to provide for you. I will be your covering from this point on. What God is challenging here is the husband who rejects caring for his wife, protecting her, providing for her, and instead taking care of himself, covering himself with his own resources and his own interests. Does physical or emotional abuse constitute desertion of a marriage? Does it warrant divorce? The abuse has certainly broken faith with the abused. If the abuser is a member in the church, then the leadership of the church needs to become involved, and discipline of that abuser may have to be taken if they refuse to turn back to the Lord and away from the abuse, whether it be physical or emotional. The leadership of the church should also guard the abused and protect the abused, particularly if there's physical abuse or if there is extreme emotional and psychological abuse. The church must step in and protect the abused person, and especially if the abused asks for that protection. There need to be people who will come alongside of the abused during those times of difficulty. A declaration of divorce by a civil court is not necessarily valid and binding in the eyes of God. Remember that in a wedding ceremony, all of this is taking place in the presence of God. And the vows are made not just between the husband and the wife, but also before before God. And therefore, we simply can't walk away from a marriage because we've gotten some paper that says we are no longer married. If a wife divorces her husband and marries another man, and it was for unbiblical reasons, she actually commits adultery against her husband. The same is true if the husband walks away from the wife and marries someone else, and it's not a biblical reason. The man who marries a divorced woman commits adultery if it has not been a biblical divorce. Now, if divorce occurs because of adultery, because of a desertion, then the innocent spouse is released from the bonds of marriage and is free to remarry. Other cases, as we have mentioned, are not always quite so clear. Cases of abuse, cases of addiction. Regardless, every effort should be made by the church leadership to try to bring about reconciliation, because it brings honor to God and it restores a damaged picture of God. It brings back into question, why is it that we get married in the first place? Is it for our own joy, our own satisfaction, our own pleasure? Or is it for serving God's purposes and God's honor, and hoping that by our marriage we are a good reflection, we are a good resemblance, a good representation to the watching world of the triune God? And therefore we are dependent on God to help us to do things that will glorify Him, that will please Him. Marriage is not a case of I get what I want and I manipulate you in order to get what I want. It's a matter of sacrifice. Marriage is one of the many ways in which we can die to ourselves and live to God. Dying to self is not easy. What God has done is helped us to die to ourselves by offering us the joys and the pleasures that are in a marriage. No marriage is perfect, but a marriage that seeks to please God is going to bring a tremendous amount of joy to the husband and the wife, as well as, of course, to God. By honoring Christ, our hearts are changed and our selfishness withers, and our ability to love, to forgive, to extend grace begins to grow in a good marriage. Let's briefly cover about 8 principles for conflict resolution that come from Genesis 3 and all throughout Scripture. The first, the weight of glory that exists in a marriage reveals the brokenness of our ability to bear its weight. Our marriage needs the gospel. Every marriage needs the gospel and needs it every day. Every day we need to be forgiving each other and asking for forgiveness for ourselves. Secondly, in a marriage, for a husband and wife, they're intimate allies against an outside enemy. The enemy is not your spouse. The enemy is Satan, who is trying to destroy a picture of God, and therefore resolution and conflict resolution has to use the spiritual weapons and armor that God gives. Third, we need to deal with our own sin first, as Matthew 7, 3 through 5 indicates. Maybe we're the problem, and we need to look at ourselves first. Fourth, Ephesians 4:26 encourages us to deal with the issue immediately, not go to bed sleeping on it. We only get angrier when that happens. Fifth, our initial response is often flight or fight. Instead, what we need to do is come together to identify the problem and work on it together. The problem is seldom someone else. The problem is usually both in the marriage, and only both can work on the problems. Only each one can work on their own part of the problem, what they bring to the conflict. Sixth, we need to watch communication. Ephesians 4:15 talks about that. Proverbs 15:1 talks about a gentle answer, not a harsh answer, a kind answer, a building up instead of a tearing down answer. Seventh, we never forget about love. 1 Corinthians 13 should always be a passage that we go back to in conflict resolution, because it's about sacrificing ourselves. And most importantly, to remember Christ, as Colossians 3 talks about in verses 12 through 17, forgiving each other as Christ forgave us. Those are the roles in conflict resolution. The husband should take the lead in seeking to resolve the conflict and seeking for reconciliation. The wife's role is to lead in encouraging, reassuring, forgiving, nurturing, a return to love. When those things are there, then conflicts can be resolved, and when they're resolved, they bring God great joy. 2 of his children coming back together again and loving each other and agreeing with each other, and then working together to bring God glory. As Christian leaders, you are called on to help in conflict resolution, and you are called on to resolve the conflicts that you have in your family, in the church, among the leadership. Don't walk away. Work together. God will be there. We have the promise in Matthew 18:20, where 2 or 3 are gathered together in his name. He is there with them. If it's you and somebody else that you disagree with, that's the 2. The 3 is Christ coming to help you and to share all of his resources with you that you need to be able to forgive, to extend mercy, and to rebuild that relationship. Thank you. We'll see you next class.